Dawn breaking over snow-covered South Dakota plains, bloodstains in pristine snow. December 29, 1890. The temperature hovers near zero. Snow blankets the South Dakota plains. In 90 minutes, the United States Army will open fire on unarmed men, women, and children. By noon, nearly 300 Lakota Sioux will lie dead in the frozen earth, including infants still strapped to their mothers' backs. This is not a battle. This is not warfare. This is the Wounded Knee Massacre, and it marks the final, blood-soaked chapter of America's Indian Wars. What happened on that frozen morning would haunt a nation and destroy a people already fighting for survival. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of unspeakable violence, we must go back to broken promises, back to stolen land, back to a people who refused to disappear. Title card fades in. Wounded Knee Massacre, the day America killed 300 unarmed natives. Sweeping Great Plains, buffalo herds, traditional Lakota villages. The Lakota Sioux were not always confined to reservations. For centuries, they were the masters of the Great Plains. Their territory stretched across present-day North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana, over 14 million acres of sacred land. They followed the buffalo, they honored the land, they lived in harmony with the seasons. The Lakota were warriors, yes, but also philosophers, parents, storytellers. They had complex societies, spiritual traditions older than European colonization, and a deep connection to Grandmother Earth. But by 1890, everything had changed. The buffalo, 60 million strong just decades earlier, were nearly extinct, slaughtered by white hunters to starve the plains tribes into submission. The Lakota had been forced onto reservations, their land promised to them by treaty for as long as the rivers flow and the grass grows, was systematically stolen. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 guaranteed the Lakota the Black Hills, their sacred Pahasapa, forever. But when gold was discovered there in 1874, that promise evaporated like morning mist. White miners flooded in, the U.S. government looked the other way, and when Lakota leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse resisted, they were hunted down. By late 1890, the Lakota were desperate. Confined to barren reservations, their rations cut by corrupt agents, watching their children starve, they turned to the spiritual. A new ceremony swept through the reservations like wildfire, the ghost dance. A Paiute prophet named Wovoka had a vision. He taught that if native people performed this sacred dance, their ancestors would return, the buffalo would come back, the white man would disappear, and the world would be renewed. The ghost dance was peaceful. It was prayer in motion. It was hope for a people who had nothing left, nothing but faith that the Creator had not abandoned them. But white Indian agents saw something different. They saw rebellion. They saw threat. They saw hundreds of Lakota dancing, singing, and refusing to stop despite orders. The agents panicked. They sent urgent telegrams to Washington. Indians are preparing for war. Send troops immediately. It was a lie, but it was a lie that would get 300 people killed. The Army arrived in force, the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, hungry for revenge after their devastating defeat at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier. They surrounded the reservations, they arrested leaders, and on December 15, 1890, they killed the most famous Lakota of all, Sitting Bull. Shot dead during a botched arrest at his home, the warrior who defeated Custer,
the chief who refused to surrender, murdered by Indian police working for the government. He was 59 years old. When Sitting Bull died, panic rippled through the Lakota community. One chief, Bigfoot, also known as Spotted Elk, led a band of about 350 Miniconjou and Hunkapapa Lakota, men, women, children, elders. Bigfoot was not a warrior chief. He was 65 years old, suffering from pneumonia in the bitter December cold. He was a peace chief, known among his people for his ability to settle disputes. When frightened Lakota came to him after Sitting Bull's death, he decided to lead them to the Pine Ridge Reservation, where Red Cloud, another prominent chief, might offer protection. They traveled through brutal winter conditions. Bigfoot, desperately ill, rode in a wagon. The temperature plunged below zero. Ice clung to their blankets. Children cried from hunger and cold. They were not fleeing to make war. They were fleeing for their lives. But the army didn't see refugees. They saw hostiles. Military commanders reviewing maps, cavalry mounting horses. Major Samuel Whiteside and the 7th Cavalry intercepted Bigfoot's band on December 28th near Porcupine Butte. The Lakota were exhausted, starving, freezing. Bigfoot, coughing blood from pneumonia, raised a white flag immediately. He surrendered without resistance.
Whiteside accepted the surrender. He promised them safety. He escorted them to a place called Wounded Knee Creek, and there he ordered them to make camp. Soldiers surrounded them completely. 4 Hotchkiss guns, rapid-fire artillery capable of firing 50 explosive rounds per minute, were positioned on a hill overlooking the camp. That night, December 28th, the Lakota huddled in their tents, surrounded by 500 soldiers and heavy artillery. Bigfoot burned with fever. Mothers tried to comfort terrified children, and some of the younger men, knowing what had happened to Sitting Bull, wondered if they would see another sunrise. Colonel James Forsyth arrived that evening to take command. Forsyth was a Civil War veteran and Custer's former commander. His orders were clear: disarm the Lakota and escort them to a military prison in Omaha. But what would happen the next morning, no one could have predicted. Dawn breaking, frost on tents, soldiers moving into position. December 29th, 1890. Morning dawns cold and gray. The soldiers have been drinking through the night. It's later confirmed that many are drunk. They're nervous, aggressive. Some still harbor resentment over Custer's defeat, even though most of these Lakota had nothing to do with the Battle of Little Bighorn. At around 8 a.m., Colonel Forsyth orders the Lakota men to assemble. About 120 men gather in the center of camp, while women and children remain in the tents. Soldiers surround them completely, guns ready. Forsyth, through an interpreter, orders the Lakota to surrender all weapons. A few old rifles are reluctantly handed over, hunting weapons, family heirlooms, tools for survival. But Forsyth isn't satisfied. He orders soldiers to search the tents. Imagine this moment. You're a Lakota man. You've surrendered peacefully. You're surrounded by 500 armed soldiers and artillery, and now those soldiers are invading your family's tent, throwing aside your belongings, terrifying your wife and children. The searches are violent, aggressive, humiliating. Soldiers overturn bedding, tear through personal possessions, handle sacred objects with contempt. Lakota women shrink back, holding their children close, remembering stories of what soldiers have done to Native women in the past. The soldiers find more weapons, knives, a few more old rifles, even some that the Lakota likely kept hidden because they were their only means of protection. The tension is unbearable. Lakota men stand rigid, watching soldiers ransack their homes. Some pray quietly, others stare straight ahead, faces like stone. And then,
A medicine man named Yellowbird begins to perform the ghost dance. Yellowbird, wearing his ghost dance shirt, believed to be impervious to bullets, begins moving through the circle. He sings, he throws dust into the air. He reminds the young men that they are wearing their ghost dance shirts, that the ancestors are watching, that they should not fear. The soldiers don't understand Lakota. They don't know what Yellowbird is saying, but they see a spiritual leader moving among armed men in an already explosive situation. Officers shout orders, soldiers raise their rifles, fingers move to triggers. And then they try to disarm a young Lakota man named Black Coyote. Black Coyote is deaf. He's also one of the few Lakota men who owns a valuable rifle, a Winchester he likely paid dearly for. When soldiers grab him to take his weapon, he doesn't understand the shouted commands. He doesn't hear the orders. He resists, not to fight, but because he's confused, frightened, and doesn't want to surrender his expensive rifle without compensation. Two soldiers seize him. There's a struggle. The rifle is pointing upward, and then a shot rings out. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired first. Was it Black Coyote's rifle discharged accidentally during the struggle? Was it a nervous soldier? In the chaos, it doesn't matter. That single shot is the spark that ignites the powder keg. Within seconds, literally seconds, the 7th Cavalry opens fire. Rifles crack in deafening waves. Soldiers fire point blank into the circle of Lakota men. At this range, there is no missing. Bodies crumple instantly. Blood sprays across the frozen ground. And then, the Hotchkiss guns open fire from the hill. Boom, boom, boom. 50 explosive rounds per minute rain down on the camp. The 2-pound shells tear through canvas tents. They rip through human bodies. They explode among women and children who are running, screaming, trying desperately to escape. Mothers grab their children and run. Soldiers shoot them in the back. Elders, too frail to flee, are cut down where they sit. Young men, those few who manage to grab weapons, fight back desperately and are obliterated by artillery fire. The Wounded Knee Creek camp becomes hell on earth. The battle, if you can even call it that, lasts less than an hour, but the killing goes on much longer. Lakota survivors run for a ravine south of the camp, desperately seeking cover. Soldiers pursue them. The Hotchkiss guns swivel to target the ravine, firing explosive shells into the gully where dozens of women and children are hiding. Wounded Knee is not combat. It's a massacre. Soldiers later testify to finding women and children 3 miles from the camp, shot in the back while fleeing. Babies are found still clutched in their dead mother's arms, killed by the same bullets. One Lakota woman, already wounded, covers her infant with her body. Soldiers find them and shoot the woman again to make sure she's dead. The baby survives initially, crying beneath its mother's corpse, only to freeze to death in the bitter cold before rescuers arrive days later. Bigfoot, the peace chief who surrendered under a white flag, is killed early in the massacre. He dies in front of his tent, his fevered body riddled with bullets. The pneumonia that racked him for days is now irrelevant. The man who spent his life settling disputes dies violently in a war he never wanted. When the guns finally fall silent, the snow at Wounded Knee Creek is no longer white. It's red. Bodies lie everywhere, twisted, broken, frozen in their final moments. A few Lakota survivors, wounded and traumatized, manage to crawl away into the hills.
Aftermath. Bodies in snow. Smoke clearing. Absolute silence. The Army counts its casualties. 25 soldiers killed, 39 wounded. But here's what they don't tell you. At least half of those casualties were from friendly fire. In their frenzy to kill Lakota, soldiers shot each other with crossfire and artillery shells. Lakota casualties.
At least 250 confirmed dead, likely closer to 300. Nearly 2/3 of them are women and children. 250 unarmed people slaughtered in America by the United States Army. Blizzard conditions, bodies buried in snow. After the massacre, a blizzard moves in. For 3 days, the bodies lie where they fell, slowly buried by snow. The temperature drops further. Any wounded Lakota who survived the initial slaughter now face death by exposure. On New Year's Day, 1891, 3 days after the massacre, a burial party arrives. They find a frozen nightmare. Bodies are contorted in their death throes, covered in frost. Some have been partially eaten by animals. Mothers and children are frozen together in final embraces. Mass grave being dug, bodies being loaded on wagons. The Army digs a mass grave on the hill where the Hotchkiss guns were positioned. They pile the bodies into a long trench without ceremony, without respect, without even recording all the names. 146 bodies go into that mass grave. The actual death toll is certainly higher. Many wounded died in the hills or were carried away by survivors. But here's the truly sickening part. While the burial party works, photographers set up cameras. They pose soldiers with frozen corpses. They take souvenir photographs of Bigfoot's frozen body. And later, soldiers will sell Lakota belongings, ghost dance shirts, moccasins, even items taken from the dead as souvenirs and war trophies. Historical photographs then transition to survivors. A few dozen Lakota survived. 51 wounded, mostly women and children, were taken to a makeshift hospital in a church at Pine Ridge. The church still had Christmas decorations hanging. Above the pulpit was a banner that read, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." Bitter, painful pause. 4 babies were found alive, orphaned, traumatized. One infant girl, Lost Bird, was adopted by a white soldier. She would spend her entire life caught between 2 worlds, never fully accepted by either, dying at age 29, another casualty of Wounded Knee, just delayed. Military tribunals, newspaper headlines. In the days after Wounded Knee, the Army moved quickly, not to deliver justice, but to control the narrative. They called it a battle. They claimed the Lakota fired first. They insisted their soldiers acted appropriately in self-defense. Pause. 1 second. Some journalists and humanitarians saw through the lies. They called it what it was, a massacre. They interviewed survivors. They counted the bodies of women and children shot in the back miles from the camp. They documented the atrocities. Newspaper articles, survivor testimonies. But their voices were drowned out by the military's propaganda machine. The Army held an inquiry and cleared itself of any wrongdoing. Colonel Forsyth, who commanded the operation, was briefly relieved of duty, then quietly reinstated. No one was court-martialed. No one went to prison. No one faced consequences for slaughtering 300 unarmed people.
Worse, far worse. The Army awarded 20 Medals of Honor to soldiers who participated in the Wounded Knee Massacre. 20! America's highest military decoration given to men for killing unarmed women and children. To put that in perspective, more Medals of Honor were awarded for Wounded Knee than for any other single battle in American history. Think about that. D-Day, Iwo Jima, Gettysburg. None earned as many Medals of Honor as the slaughter of unarmed Lakota at Wounded Knee.
Those medals have never been officially rescinded, despite decades of calls to do so. They remain on the books, a permanent, shameful stain on American military honor. Wounded Knee marked the end of the Indian Wars. After December 29, 1980, armed Native resistance to U.S. expansion effectively ceased. The frontier was won. The West was settled. And the Lakota, like hundreds of other tribes, were forced to accept life on reservations, poverty, dependency, and cultural suppression. But the trauma of Wounded Knee never faded. It passed from generation to generation. Grandparents who survived told their grandchildren, families preserved memories of those who died, and the Lakota people carried the weight of that day like a sacred burden. In 1973, Wounded Knee returned to national consciousness. Members of the American Indian movement occupied the site for 71 days, demanding recognition of treaty rights and an end to government corruption. The occupation turned into an armed standoff. 2 people died. Wounded Knee became a symbol of Native resistance all over again. Today, there is a memorial at Wounded Knee. A simple sign marks the mass grave. Visitors leave prayer ties, flowers, and tobacco offerings. The site is sacred, not just to the Lakota, but to all Native people, as a reminder of what was stolen, what was destroyed, and what must never be forgotten. But here's what most Americans don't know. The conditions that led to Wounded Knee, poverty, broken treaties, systemic racism, cultural destruction, still exist. Native American reservations have some of the highest rates of poverty, suicide, and substance abuse in the nation. Promised resources never arrive, treaty rights are still violated, and the descendants of Wounded Knee survivors still fight for justice. Wounded Knee is not ancient history, it's 1890, within living memory of our great-grandparents. The children who survived that day lived into the 1960s and 70s. The trauma is that recent, the injustice is that fresh. So why does Wounded Knee matter today? Why should you care about something that happened over 130 years ago?
Because this is American history. Not the sanitized version they taught us in school, but the real, painful, complicated truth. Wounded Knee is part of who we are as a nation, the good and the horrific. We cannot understand America without understanding what happened to the people who were here first. The Lakota people survived Wounded Knee. They survived forced assimilation, boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man, decades of poverty and neglect. They're still here, still fighting, still preserving their language, their culture, their sacred traditions. But survival is not justice. Remembering is not enough. Those 20 medals of honor should be rescinded. The treaty should be honored. The promises should be kept. And the descendants of Wounded Knee, all Native Americans, deserve more than our pity. They deserve our action. Learn the real history. Support Native-led organizations, advocate for treaty rights, amplify Indigenous voices, and never forget that on December 29, 1890, on a frozen creek in South Dakota, the United States government murdered 300 unarmed people and called it a victory. This is their story. This is our history. This is Wounded Knee. To the memory of the men, women, and children who died at Wounded Knee Creek, to the survivors who carried this truth forward, and to the Lakota people who endure.
Subscribe for more Untold American history. Comment below, what did you learn that you weren't taught in school?